The fire is dying down now, settling into a bed of glowing, breathing embers that pulse with a soft, rhythmic orange light against the gathering dark. And if you listen closely, past the crackle of the wood and the settling of the ash, you can hear the wind moving through the tall, dry grass outside, a sound like a long, hushed exhale from the lungs of the earth itself. The air's cooling rapidly, carrying the distinct, sharp scent of frost on stone and the heavy, damp perfume of distant pine forests, waiting for the snow, a smell that feels ancient, as if the molecules themselves remember a time when winter was not just a season, but a sprawling, hungry creature that swallowed the horizon whole. We are sitting on the edge of a vast, unseen plain, the starlight above us brittle and clear, shivering through the cold atmosphere. And it feels as though we are waiting for something, watching the shadows stretch and merge across the ground. We imagine this change happened suddenly, that one day the sky simply turned gray and the ice descended like a curtain falling on a stage. But the truth is slower, quieter, and far more unsettling, a creeping silence that enters the room so gradually you do not notice the temperature dropping until you can see your own breath hanging in the air. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. We are traveling back now, drifting like smoke against the wind, moving deeper into the archives of the planet's memory, past the cities of stone and steel, past the first farmers turning the soil, past the hunters painting bison on cave walls, all the way back to a time roughly 2.5 million years ago. A time when the world was settling into a curious and reliable slumber. This is the era of the early Pleistocene, though to the animals grazing on the scrublands and the early ancestors of humanity looking up at these same unfamiliar stars, it is simply the world as it is, a place of rhythmic, predictable change. For most of Earth's recent history, the ice ages followed a quiet, almost polite rhythm, a heartbeat that pulsed once every 41,000 years, guided by the gentle nodding of the planet on its axis. We call this obliquity, the way the Earth rocks back and forth like a cradle or a spinning top losing its momentum, tilting slightly toward the sun and then tilting away again. And for over 1 million years, this rocking motion was the conductor of the climate's orchestra. When the tilt was high, the summers at the poles were warm enough to melt the snow that had fallen the winter before, and the glaciers would retreat, pulling back to the mountain peaks like a tide going out, leaving behind wet, glistening rock and new rivers. When the tilt was low, the summers were cool, too pale and weak to melt the winter's accumulation, and the snow would stay, layer upon layer, pressing down, hardening into ice, beginning the slow march downward again. It was a regular world, a linear world where cause and effect held hands tightly. The sun shifted and the ice responded, an obedient dance between the heavens and the surface. Life adapted to this metronome, evolution finding a comfort in the repetition, the forests expanding and contracting, the herds migrating north and south in time with the 41,000-year breath. It seems almost peaceful from this distance, a balanced equation where the ice never grew too angry, never stayed too long, a world where the winters were deep but not eternal. Scientists looking at the chemical ghosts trapped in ancient ocean sediments see this rhythm clearly, a jagged line of ups and downs that looks like a heartbeat on a monitor, steady and reassuring. But as we sit here by our fading fire, watching the smoke drift up toward the Milky Way, we must understand that stability is often an illusion, a temporary truce between forces we cannot see and do not fully understand. We tend to think of the ground beneath our feet as solid, of the climate as a background setting for the drama of our lives. But the Earth is a restless sleeper, and deep within its systems, hidden in the currents of the oceans and the chemistry of the air, something was beginning to shift, a tiny flaw in the pattern, a hesitation in the beat. The 41,000-year cycle, so dominant and so reliable, began to lose its grip, though no creature living through it could have possibly sensed the change. It was too slow for eyes or ears, a transformation measured not in seasons or lifetimes, but in the erosion of mountain ranges and the slow burial of carbon in the deep sea. We are approaching the edge of a mystery, a threshold known as the mid-Pleistocene transition, a dry academic name for a monumental disruption that would rewrite the rules of survival for everything on the planet. Imagine standing on a shoreline where the tide usually comes in and goes out like clockwork, only to find that one day the water does not stop rising, or that when it retreats it goes out so far it reveals the bones of the ocean floor, and it does not return for a very, very long time. This is what happened to the ice. Roughly 1 million years ago, the glaciers stopped listening to the 41,000-year tilt. They ignored the command to melt, ignored the slightly warmer summers, and simply kept growing, piling higher and thicker, pressing down with a weight that deformed the crust of the earth. The cycle stretched, slowing down, dragging out from 41,000 years to a massive, lumbering rhythm of 100,000 years. The ice ages became longer, the cold became deeper, and the warm breaks between them, the interglacials, like the one we are lucky enough to live in now, became short, feverish bursts of heat before the freeze returned. It is a change that defies simple logic. For the sunlight falling on the Earth did not change drastically. The batteries of the solar system did not suddenly surge with power, yet the machine of the climate began to run with a terrifying new intensity. The Serbian mathematician Milutin Milankovic, who first calculated the celestial mechanics, would have nodded at the 41,000-year cycle, seeing the clear geometry of the tilt, but even he might have paused at the emergence of the 100,000-year beat, which corresponds to the shape of Earth's orbit, its eccentricity, a signal so weak, so subtle in terms of solar energy, that it should be drowned out by the other rhythms. It is like hearing a drummer whispering in a storm. Yet somehow, the storm begins to move in time with the whisper. We are left with the sensation of a paradox, a heavy, cold riddle wrapped in the silence of deep time. The wind out on the plains is picking up now, rustling the dry stalks of the grass, sounding like the friction of silk on stone, and the firelight dips low, casting long, wavering shadows that look like the tusks of great beasts or the edges of advancing glaciers. We are safe here, for the moment, wrapped in the warmth of the present tense, but out there in the dark, in the vast stretch of history behind us, the rhythm is breaking. The reliable world of the 41,000-year summer is fading away, replaced by something slower, heavier, and far more difficult to wake from. The ice is beginning to learn a new trick, learning how to survive the sun, learning how to hold its ground, and as the embers glow a deep sullen red, we can almost feel the weight of what is coming, a pressure building in the atmosphere, a changing of the guard that happened without a sound, without a witness, a shift that would turn the Earth into a different kind of planet entirely, one where winter is the rule and warmth is only a fleeting exception. The transition has begun, though the sky looks the same and the stars have not moved, and we are left watching the dark, waiting for the first sign that the old contract has been broken. To understand the world as it was before the great deepening, we must leave the warmth of our small fire and let our minds drift upward, rising through the layers of the atmosphere, past the thin, wispy clouds catching the last of the moonlight, past the silent auroras curtaining the poles in green and violet, until we are floating in the profound, crushing silence of space, looking back at our home. From here, suspended in the velvet vacuum, the Earth does not look like a place of struggle or ice, but like a perfect, polished jewel, a swirl of blue ocean and brown continent wrapped in the swirling white of weather systems, spinning silently against the backdrop of the cosmos. It seems steady, this blue marble, rotating with the confidence of a clock that has never lost a second. But if we were to watch it for long enough, if we could speed up time so that centuries flickered by like frames in an old film, we would see that it is not perfectly steady at all. It wobbles. Like a spinning top that is just beginning to lose its perfect balance, or a ship gently rolling on a long, slow swell, the Earth nods on its axis, tilting towards the sun and then rocking back away from it. This motion is called obliquity, a word that feels round and heavy in the mouth, like a stone worn smooth by a river, and it is perhaps the most important dancer in the ancient ballet of the climate. Imagine a line drawn through the North and South poles, the invisible skewer around which the planet turns. This line is not straight up and down relative to the path we travel around the sun. It is tipped over, leaning, and the angle of that lean is never constant. It breathes. Over a span of roughly 41,000 years, the Earth bows down and straightens up, shifting between a tilt of about 22 degrees and 24.5 degrees. It seems like such a tiny thing, a difference of just 2 or 3 degrees, the kind of adjustment you might make when straightening a picture frame on a wall. Yet, in the delicate, finely tuned engine of the global climate, this subtle nod is the difference between an era of forests and an era of ice. We tend to think that ice ages are caused by the world getting colder overall, by the sun dimming or the fires of the earth going out. But the truth is more nuanced, more seasonal. The key to building a glacier is not really about how cold the winter is, for winters at the poles are always cold enough for snow to fall. The secret lies in the summer. To build an ice sheet, you must simply ensure that the snow which fell in winter does not melt away when the days grow long. You need a cool summer, a pale, weak summer where the sun hangs low in the sky and fails to strip the white blanket from the land. When the Earth's tilt is low, standing more upright, the polar regions are turned slightly away from the direct glare of the sun during the summer months. The sunlight hits the high latitudes at a shallow angle, glancing off the white snow like a stone skipping across a pond, failing to deliver enough heat to melt the year's accumulation. The snow survives. It sits there through June, July, and August, reflecting the sun's energy back into space, keeping the ground cool, waiting for the shadows of autumn to return. Then, when the next winter comes, new snow falls on top of the old, compressing it, hardening it, turning the bottom layers into firm blue ice. Year after year, century after century, the low tilt protects the ice, nurturing it, allowing the glaciers to creep down from the mountains and spread across the plains. This is the ice house phase of the cycle. But the Earth does not stay still. The invisible gravity of the other planets, the great giants Jupiter and Saturn, tugs at us, and slowly, inexorably, the axis begins to tilt further over. As the angle increases, the planet leans more eagerly towards the sun during the summer solstice. Now, the sunlight strikes the poles more directly, pouring energy into the high latitudes. The summers become fierce and bright, the air warms, the meltwater streams begin to gush, and the snow that survived the winter is attacked by the heat. Under a high tilt, the glaciers recoil. They sweat and fracture, pulling back to the highest peaks, leaving the valleys green and open for the return of the trees. This was the heartbeat of the 41,000-year cycle, a pendulum swinging between the cool summer of growth and the hot summer of retreat. It is strange to think that the destiny of a woolly mammoth grazing in Siberia or a hominid walking in the Rift Valley was tied to a geometric angle, to a silent nod happening in the vacuum of space. But nature is a unified system, and the sky touches the ground in ways we often forget. For millions of years, this rocking motion was the dominant rhythm. It was reliable. It was the great year of the geological timescale. The Earth would tilt, and the ice would grow. The Earth would straighten, and the ice would melt. There was a neatness to it, a predictability that a scientist might find satisfying, like a well-solved equation. The sun itself did not need to change its output. The Earth simply changed how it received the gift of light, redistributing the energy from the equator to the poles and back again. It is a reminder that in a complex system, position is everything. You do not need to turn down the furnace to freeze the house. You only need to close the vents in the upstairs rooms. And so the planet danced this slow waltz, bowing and rising, bowing and rising. It is said by some astronomers that if the Earth did not have its moon, that large, steadying hand on our shoulder, our wobble would be chaotic, tilting wildly and causing climate catastrophes that would make life impossible. So perhaps we should look up at the moon with a little more gratitude, thanking it for keeping the music steady. But in the era we are remembering, the early Pleistocene, the music was about to change key. The 41,000-year cycle, which had been the master of the clock for so long, was preparing to hand over control to something else, something darker and more sluggish. We can imagine the planet spinning there in the dark, innocent of what is to come, completing another tilt, another nod, while down on the surface, the layers of snow are packing down, recording the history of the tilt in tiny bubbles of ancient air. The mechanism seems perfect, eternal, a celestial machine built to run forever. But machines wear down, or rather, the parts begin to interact in new ways. The tilt remained the same. The Earth still rocks today just as it did then, but the ice was about to stop listening. It was about to find a way to survive even the hot summers, to ignore the command of the sun. The dance of tilt and sun was ending its solo performance, and the stage was being set for a duet with the deep Earth, a partnership that would plunge the world into a cold unlike anything it had known before. We drift back down from space now, descending through the clouds, leaving the silent geometry of the orbit behind, to see what this rhythm looked like on the ground, where the seasons were not abstract angles, but matters of life and death. Down here, beneath the canopy of an ancient tangled oak forest that stretches further than any map we know today, the air is thick with the smell of wet moss and the decomposing sweetness of fallen leaves, a scent that speaks of a world in constant fertile motion. We have landed in a time roughly 2 million years ago, a time when the Earth's pulse was steady and the seasons arrived with the punctuality of a trusted friend. It is quiet here, save for the snapping of twigs under heavy feet and the call of birds whose songs have drifted, note by note, into the species we hear in our own gardens today. This is the world of the 41,000-year beat, and to the creatures living within it, there is no sense of doom, no awareness of the great freeze waiting in the future. There is only the reliable turning of the wheel. The winters, when they come, are certainly cold. Frost coats the spiderwebs in silver intricate lace, and the breath of the herd steams in the morning light, but they are not the crushing, unending winters that will come later. The ice sheets sit politely in the far north, like sleeping white giants that wake up and stretch their legs every few millennia, but rarely venture far enough south to devour the heart of the continents. Because the cold is not yet an apocalypse, the land remains a tapestry of green and brown, a mosaic where forests and grasslands shake hands rather than warring for dominance. We can see this balance in the animals that move through the mist. Drifting through the trees is a herd of Mammuthus meridionalis, the southern mammoth, a creature that looks like a rough draft of the famous woolly cousins that will become icons of the Ice Age. These giants are colossal, taller at the shoulder than the ones who will trudge through the deep snows of the future, but they are not wrapped in thick, shaggy coats of fur. They do not need to be. Their hair is shorter, lighter, suited for a climate that bites but does not kill. They move with a slow, swaying grace, stripping bark from the trees with trunks that are testing the world for texture and taste, confident that the spring will return before their fat reserves run dry. There is a calmness to their grazing, a lack of desperation that permeates the entire ecosystem. It seems that life in this era has struck a bargain with the planet. As long as the tilt rocks back and forth on its schedule, life will adjust its migrations and its shedding, staying in step with the music. The forests themselves are breathing in this rhythm, a respiration measured in millennia rather than seconds. When the tilt is high and the summers are warm, the broadleaf trees, the oaks, the maples, the beeches, march northward, reclaiming the land from the tundra, dropping their seeds into soil that has only recently thawed. When the tilt lowers and the cool summers allow the ice to creep forward, the trees retreat, dropping back to the south, waiting out the cold phase in the refuges of the Mediterranean or the warmer valleys. It is a slow-motion tide of sap and wood, advancing and retreating, advancing and retreating. Pollen grains trapped in the mud of ancient lake beds tell this story perfectly, layers of tree pollen alternating with layers of grass and sedge, a striped record of a world that knew exactly what to expect. This predictability allowed for a certain richness, a complexity in the food web that felt stable. Predators knew where the herds would be. The herds knew where the water would flow. Our own ancestors, small bands of Homo erectus or their kin, were moving through this landscape as well, learning to read the sky, learning which roots to dig when the frost came, living in the spaces between the great beasts. They were not yet the masters of fire and clothing that they would become. They were nudists in a garden that was occasionally chilly but rarely lethal. They survived because the world made sense. If the rains failed one year, they would likely return the next. If the herds moved south, they would surely come back north. There was a trust in the environment that is hard for us to imagine now, living as we do in a time of rapid, jagged change. One might imagine a young southern mammoth calf, perhaps a bit clumsy as all young things are, slipping on a patch of morning ice and sliding into a muddy stream bank with a surprise trumpet, a moment of slapstick in the solemn procession of prehistory, only to be nudged back up by its mother's trunk. It is a gentle reminder that even in deep time, the mundane struggles of growing up were the same. The physics of mud and gravity have not changed, even if the stars have shifted their positions. And yet, there is a danger in such comfort. A stable system is a lulling system. When the climate repeats itself so faithfully, evolution fine-tunes its creations for that specific rhythm, specializing them for a world that stays within certain boundaries. The southern mammoth was perfectly designed for the mix of forest and savanna, for the mild interglacials and the manageable glacials. It was not designed for a world where the ice would lock the land away for 100,000 years at a time. It was a creature of the 41,000-year cycle, a masterpiece of the specific moment. Perhaps this is the tragedy written into the DNA of the early Pleistocene. It was too successful at being what it was. The Earth was fostering a diversity of life that depended on the rules remaining the same. Scientists studying the fossils of this time often debate the exact density of the tree cover, arguing over whether it was a closed canopy or a more open parkland, a scholarly disagreement that takes place in hushed tones over microscopes, but they agree on the general stability. The climate system seemed to have found a groove, a strange attractor in the language of chaos theory, looping round and round the same set of conditions. It felt like an eternal present, a forever after of moderate swings. But as we watch the herd vanish into the fog, their gray shapes dissolving like smoke, we must remember the lesson of the tilt. The Earth is never truly still. While the surface world enjoyed its rhythmic slumber, deep in the bedrock, deep in the chemistry of the oceans, the conditions for stability were eroding. The very act of the glaciers coming and going, even these smaller, polite glaciers, was doing work. They were scraping. They were grinding. Like a sculptor slowly sanding down a block of marble, the ice was changing the shape of the continents beneath it. It was a process so slow it was invisible to the mammoths and the hominids, invisible even to the forests that grew and died 1,000 times over. But friction is a powerful thing. The predictable seasons were acting like a file, sharpening the conditions for a new, harsher reality. The calm of this world, the reliable 41,000-year heartbeat, was not a permanent state, but a pause, a gathering of breath before a scream. The sun continued to rise and set, the moon tugged at the tides, and the earth nodded in its sleep, but the dream was about to change. The mechanism that kept the ice in check was wearing thin, and the warm, manageable world of the southern mammoth was walking unknowingly toward a cliff edge, guided by the very rhythm that had kept it safe for so long. It begins not with a roar, but with a silence so deep and pervasive that it slips beneath the threshold of hearing, inhabiting the spaces between the wind and the waves. We are moving forward now, crossing the invisible boundary of the 1,000,000-year mark, drifting into the shadow of the mid-Pleistocene transition. This is the moment when the history books of the climate begin to blur, when the clear, legible text of the 41,000-year cycle becomes smeared and difficult to read. Something is happening to the Earth, something internal and profound. Yet if you were to stand on the edge of a cliff overlooking the Atlantic during this time, you would see nothing but the same gray water rolling in to strike the same gray stone. The change is not in the view, it is in the engine room. For nearly 1.5 million years, the climate had been a faithful servant to the tilt of the axis, but now the servant is beginning to rebel. The first sign is a strange hesitation in the melt. The summers come, the tilt increases, the sun beats down on the high northern latitudes, just as it always has, but the ice lingers. It does not retreat as quickly as it once did. It clings to the shadows of the valleys, hiding under layers of insulating debris, stubborn and sullen. The 41,000-year summer arrives, knocks on the door, and finds the door locked. The ice sheets, which used to be responsive, fluid things, are becoming heavy and lethargic. They miss their cue to leave. This lagging behind creates a kind of interference pattern in the climate, a discordance where the rhythm of the sky and the rhythm of the ice no longer match. It is like watching two dancers who have lost the beat, stepping on each other's toes, stumbling into a new, awkward embrace. Scientists call this a regime shift, a clinical term that masks the sheer strangeness of what is occurring. The Earth is moving from a linear world, where A causes B, into a non-linear world, where A might cause B, or it might cause nothing at all, or it might trigger a catastrophe, depending on the hidden state of the system. Why now? Why, after millions of years of obedience, does the planet decide to change the rules? This is the silence before the shift, the pregnant pause where the old ways are dying, but the new ways have not yet been born. One theory whispers that the culprit lies in the bedrock itself, in the very ground the ice rests upon. For eons, the glaciers had been sliding over a thick layer of loose ancient soil, a greasy, slippery mixture of clay and weathered rock known as regolith. This layer acted like a lubricant, allowing the ice to flow fast and thin, spreading out quickly but also melting quickly when the temperature rose. It made the ice sheets dynamic, responsive, easy to build and easy to destroy. But after dozens of glacial cycles, after the ice had scrubbed the land back and forth like a rough sponge, the regolith was beginning to run out. The glaciers had scraped the continents down to the bone, down to the hard, crystalline shield rock beneath. Ice on hard rock behaves differently than ice on soft soil. It sticks. It generates friction. It becomes anchored, harder to move and much, much harder to melt. The ice was no longer skating. It was gripping. As this friction increased, the ice sheets grew thicker and more vertical, building up into towering domes of cold that could withstand the summer sun simply by virtue of their own mass. They were becoming fortresses of ice, self-sustaining and stubborn. At the same time, deep in the Southern Ocean, the currents were slowing, the water growing colder and saltier, trapping carbon dioxide in the abyss, starving the atmosphere of heat. It was a conspiracy of factors, a silent alliance between the rock, the ice, and the sea, all working together to dampen the effect of the sun. The great year of 41,000 years was still ticking away in the sky, but the Earth was no longer listening. It was tuning into a different frequency, a lower, slower hum that resonated with the eccentric shape of the orbit itself, the 100,000-year cycle. This transition was not a sudden flip of a switch. It was a confused, chaotic stutter. The climate record from this time is messy, filled with sawtooth patterns that show the system trying to decide which rhythm to follow. Some ice ages were short, some were long, some were mild, some were brutal. It was a time of planetary indecision. Imagine the confusion of the herds, of the migrating birds, of the early humans. The signals they relied on, the timing of the rains, the retreat of the frost, were becoming erratic. The world was becoming unreliable. It feels in a way like a loss of innocence for the planet. The simple youthful days of the early Pleistocene were over, replaced by a complex, moody maturity. The Earth was discovering its own power, learning that it could amplify the cold, that it could hold on to the winter even when the sun said, spring. There is a melancholy in this shift, a sense of a door closing on a milder, gentler epoch. We can imagine a single snowflake falling during a summer that should have been warm, landing on a patch of ice that should have melted, and simply staying there. It is a tiny victory for the cold, unnoticed by anyone, but it is the beginning of the end for the old world. That single snowflake is joined by another and another until the summer passes without the ground ever seeing the sun. The silence deepens. The wind grows colder. The ice is digging in, preparing for a siege that will last not 40,000 years, but 100,000. The metronome has slowed, the heartbeat has dropped, and the Earth is sinking into a deeper, darker dream, one from which it will become increasingly difficult to wake. The paradox is taking hold. The sun is still shining, the tilt is still rocking, but the ice is no longer answering the call. The mystery has begun. It is here, in the quiet mathematics of the solar system, that we encounter the ghost in the machine, the phantom signal that haunts the history of our climate with a riddle so profound it keeps scientists awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering how a whisper can bring down a fortress. We must turn our eyes away from the Earth for a moment and look at the path we travel, the great invisible road that our planet follows around the sun. In our simplest drawings, in the diagrams we sketch for children, this orbit is a perfect circle, a ring of geometry where the Earth is always the same distance from the fire, warm and safe and constant. But nature abhors perfection. It prefers the organic, the flawed, the shifting. The truth is that our path is not a circle, or at least, it does not stay one. Over a vast sluggish cycle of roughly 100,000 years and a larger supercycle of 400,000 years, the shape of Earth's orbit breathes, it stretches. It is pulled by the heavy invisible gravity of the gas giants, Jupiter and Saturn, those distant swirling brothers who tug at us from the outer dark. When they align just so, when their gravity weaves together with ours, they pull the Earth's orbit outward, stretching it from a near-perfect circle into an ellipse, a slightly flattened oval. This stretching is called eccentricity. It is a beautiful word for a strange concept, implying a departure from the center, a wandering spirit. When the orbit is most eccentric, most oval-shaped, the Earth travels far away from the sun at one end of its journey and swings in close at the other. It seems at first glance that this should be the answer to our mystery, the smoking gun we have been looking for. If the Earth moves further away, surely it gets colder. If it moves closer, surely it gets warmer. It feels intuitive, like moving your chair back from a fireplace. But when we run the numbers, when we calculate the actual amount of sunlight lost or gained during this stretching, the theory dissolves into mist. The change is tiny, it is negligible. The difference in the total solar energy reaching the Earth due to eccentricity is less than 1/5 of 1%. It is a fluctuation so subtle it should be lost in the noise, drowned out by the seasons, by the clouds, by the tilt. Compared to the powerful rocking motion of the obliquity cycle we discussed earlier, eccentricity is nothing more than a faint background hum, a radio signal from a distant star that is barely picking up on the receiver. And yet, as we look at the climate record after the mid-Pleistocene transition, after the great silence settles over the world, it is this faint, weak signal that stands up and takes the throne. The ice ages stop marching to the loud, clear beat of the tilt and begin to march in perfect lockstep to the quiet, barely there rhythm of the 100,000-year eccentricity cycle. This is the 100,000-year problem, the central paradox of paleoclimatology. It is like watching a heavy iron door that refuses to budge when you pound on it with a sledgehammer, the tilt, but then swings open effortlessly when you tap it with a feather, the eccentricity. How can this be? How can the smallest force produce the largest consequence? It defies the linear logic we use to navigate our daily lives. In our world, if you push harder, the object moves faster. In the climate of the Middle Pleistocene, the rules of cause and effect seem to warp. Historians of science and geologists have spent decades wrestling with this, proposing complex metaphors to explain the impossible. They speak of nonlinear resonance, a fancy way of saying that the Earth system had tuned itself to a specific frequency, like a crystal glass that only shatters when a singer hits one precise, quiet note. They suggest that perhaps eccentricity is not the engine, but merely the pacemaker, the conductor who taps the baton to start the symphony, even though he does not play the instruments himself. Imagine a child on a swing set. If you push the child at the wrong time, or with a rhythm that doesn't match the swing's natural motion, your energy is wasted. The swing jerks and slows. But if you apply even the tiniest push, at the exact moment the swing reaches the top of its arc, a sweet spot in time. You can send it soaring higher and higher with almost no effort at all. Perhaps the 100,000-year cycle is that tiny push, arriving at the exact moment the Earth's ice sheets are teetering on the brink of collapse or expansion. It seems the climate system had become so unstable, or perhaps so sensitive, that it began to amplify this ghost signal, taking the whisper and turning it into a scream. The mystery deepens when we realize that this signal does not act alone. It needs the darkness to work. The eccentricity cycle creates exceptionally long, cold winters only when it aligns with other factors, creating a perfect storm of orbital geometry. But the puzzle remains. Why did the Earth ignore this signal for millions of years, only to suddenly fall under its spell 1 million years ago? What changed in the listener? It feels as though the planet itself grew weary, or perhaps more stubborn. The ice sheets, now growing larger and thicker on the friction-heavy bedrock, became deaf to the quicker, lighter commands of the tilt. They became too heavy to melt every 41,000 years. They simply sat there, enduring the warm intervals, refusing to budge, waiting for a stronger, longer, deeper push to knock them down. And so, the rhythm slowed. The 100,000-year cycle is not just a measure of time, it is a measure of resistance. It represents the triumph of inertia over energy. It is the sound of a world that has become sluggish, a world where the ice has learned to hoard the cold, storing it up like a miser hoarding gold, resisting the spending spree of the summer melt. We are left with a profound sense of unease, a realization of how fragile the balance truly is. If a signal as weak as orbital eccentricity, a tiny stretch in the path around the sun, can turn the Earth from a garden into a freezer, then the climate system is not a sturdy, resilient machine, but a precarious house of cards waiting for the slightest breath to topple it. We look up at Jupiter and Saturn with new eyes now, not just as wandering lights in the night sky, but as the architects of our winters, their gravity reaching across millions of miles of void to shape the glaciers of North America and Europe. And it is a connection that feels almost astrological in its scope, yet it is grounded in the hard, cold physics of gravity. The paradox remains unsolved in many ways, a gap in our understanding where the math does not quite add up, but the reality is undeniable. The weak signal won. The whisper drowned out the shout, and as we drift further into this era of the long winter, we must look down from space and see what this new, slow rhythm did to the face of the world, how the ice, emboldened by its new alignment with the stars, began to do something it had never done before. It began to scrub the continents clean, erasing the past to build a colder future. The paradox is not just a scientific curiosity, it is the mechanism that sculpted the land we live on today, a testament to the power of the subtle, the slow, and the invisible. We descend now from the silent mathematics of the heavens, falling through the thin, cold air until our feet touch the ground again. But the ground we land upon is not the solid, permanent foundation we often imagine it to be. It is a surface in the midst of a violent, slow-motion undressing. To understand why the ice ages changed their rhythm, we must look at what lies beneath the grass and the trees, at the skin of the Earth itself. For millions of years before the Great Freeze began, during the long, warm epochs that geologists call the Pliocene and the early Pleistocene, the continents of the northern hemisphere had been weathering under a gentle sun. Rain fell, roots dug deep, and leaves rotted, creating a thick, soft blanket of soil and loose rock known as regolith. It was a deep layer, in some places hundreds of feet thick, a crumbling, clay-heavy mixture that covered the ancient bedrock like a heavy velvet quilt. When the first polite glaciers of the 41,000-year cycle began to form, they landed on this soft bed. As the ice accumulated and began to move, sliding down from the highlands of Canada and Scandinavia, it found the going easy. The regolith was slippery, unfrozen at the bottom due to the heat seeping up from the Earth's core, and it acted as a perfect lubricant. The glaciers of this early era were like sleds gliding over wet snow. They were fast, thin, and mobile. They surged forward quickly when the climate cooled, spreading out in vast, shallow sheets, But because they were resting on this greasy, unstable layer, they were also fragile. When the sun returned and the tilt shifted, the ice collapsed just as easily as it had advanced, sliding away into the sea or melting into vast, muddy lakes. The landscape was being raised, but gently, the ice acting like a wide, flat shovel pushing the dirt around. But ice is not just a weight, it is a tool, it is sandpaper, it is a file. Over dozens of cycles, over hundreds of thousands of years of advancing and retreating, the glaciers began to do something profound. They began to strip the continents clean. It was a process of unimaginable scale, a planetary exfoliation where the ice hooked its frozen fingers into the loose soil and dragged it away, dumping it into the oceans or piling it up at the fringes of the world in great ridges of moraine. Year by year, century by century, the thick blanket of regolith was scraped off, peeled away to reveal the hard, unforgiving bone beneath. We can close our eyes and listen to the sound of this era, a low, grinding bass note that vibrates through the soles of our feet, the sound of millions of tons of ice dragging rock across rock, pulverizing stones into a fine white powder known as rock flour. This dust clouded the rivers, turning them into milky, opaque ribbons that snaked their way to the sea, carrying the memory of the landscape away with them. It seems a violent thing, this scrubbing, a theft of the earth's fertility, yet it happened with such agonizing slowness that a herd of deer, grazing on the edge of the ice, would never have noticed the ground lowering beneath them. They simply lived their lives on a surface that was slowly disappearing. By the time we reached the mid-Pleistocene transition, the work was largely done. The vast regions of the Canadian Shield and the Scandinavian Shield, those ancient crystalline hearts of the continents, lay exposed, naked, and raw. The soft, slippery clays were gone, banished to the bottom of the Atlantic or the Gulf of Mexico, and in their place was solid granite, gneiss, and basalt, rocks that had been forged in the deep fires of the earth billions of years ago. This was a fundamental change in the architecture of the Ice Age world. The playground had been altered. No longer could the glaciers slide effortlessly over a bed of grease. Now they had to move over rough, high-friction bedrock. It is like the difference between sliding in socks across a polished wooden floor and trying to drag a heavy carpet across sandpaper. The physics of movement changed instantly, or instantly in geological terms. The ice, deprived of its lubricant, began to stick. It clawed at the rough stone, freezing into the cracks and fissures, anchoring itself to the crust. This new friction meant that the glaciers could not flow as thin or as fast as they once did. Instead, they began to pile up. Unable to slide away easily, the ice grew vertically, thickening, becoming heavy and sluggish. It was no longer a mobile sheet. It was a fortress. This stripping of the regolith is one of the leading theories for why the transition happened, a concept geologists discuss with a kind of reverence for the sheer physical labor involved. They call it the regolith hypothesis, suggesting that the earth had to be flayed before it could be frozen deeply. It implies that the early ice ages were essentially a cleaning crew, preparing the stage for the true giants that were to come. We can imagine the wind howling over these newly exposed lands, blowing the fine dust of the pulverized soil into the atmosphere, where it would drift for thousands of miles before settling on the ice of Antarctica or the low S plateaus of China, a global redistribution of the ground itself. The landscape looked different now, sharper, harder, less forgiving. The rolling soil-softened hills were being carved into jagged peaks and deep U-shaped valleys. The earth was losing its softness, its chaotic organic texture, and being refined into a geometry of stone and ice. There's a certain sadness in this, a loss of the deep ancient soils that had supported the forests of the Tertiary period. But there is also a cold beauty in the revelation of the bedrock. It is as if the planet was revealing its true self, the iron skeleton that holds up the world, stripping away the decoration to face the coming long winter with armor rather than clothing. The relationship between the ice and the land had shifted from a casual, slippery embrace to a locked, grinding struggle. The ice now had to fight for every inch of movement, and in doing so, it became stronger, more stable, more resistant to the sun. The skating rink of the early Pleistocene was gone. The era of the grinding stone had begun. And as the ice anchored itself to the shield rock, it sent a message back to the atmosphere and the ocean, a signal that the easy days were over. The continents were scrubbed clean, the stage was bare, and the props of the old world had been swept into the sea. Now, when the snow fell, it would fall on cold, hard stone, and it would stay there, building a monument of ice that would not bow down to the 41,000-year cycle ever again. The friction had begun, and with it, the long, deep silence of the 100,000-year winter. The contact between the ice and the stone is no longer a casual touch, but a grip, a freezing embrace that fuses the glacier to the continent with a strength that defies the imagination. We are zoomed in now, microscopic observers hovering at the very bottom of the ice sheet, deep in the crushing dark, where the weight of 3 kilometers of frozen water rests directly upon the ancient, stripped granite of the Canadian Shield. In the old days, the days of the regolith, there was water here, a thin, muddy slurry that allowed the ice to glide. But now, the interface is dry and brutally cold. The ice has frozen directly onto the bedrock, locking its crystals into the microscopic pores and cracks of the stone, creating a bond so tight that the glacier and the ground have effectively become one single solid object. This is what glaciologists call a cold-based glacier, a term that sounds clinical, but describes a phenomenon of profound stillness. The ice is stuck. It cannot flow, it cannot slide away to the sea to relieve its own pressure, and because it cannot move horizontally, it has no choice but to grow vertically, piling layer upon layer, rising higher into the atmosphere with every winter storm. It is building a mountain of its own making, a white, shimmering dome that rivals the height of the Alps, yet it sits on the flat plains of North America and Northern Europe. This anchoring effect is the physical mechanism behind the great slowing of the cycles. Imagine the summer sun returning as the Earth tilts on its axis, that faithful 41,000-year visit. The warmth arrives, the air softens, and the surface of the ice begins to sweat, sending rivulets of blue water streaming down the flanks of the glacier. In the past, this would have been the end. The thin, slippery ice would have collapsed, sliding apart under the heat. But now, the ice is too thick, too cold, and too firmly attached to the Earth. The heat of the summer can only melt a few meters off the top, a mere scratch on the surface of a giant that stands thousands of meters tall. The cold stored within the massive core of the ice sheet fights back, absorbing the warmth without surrendering. The summer passes, the sun retreats, and the glacier is still there, scarred but standing, waiting for the winter to heal it. It has survived a full cycle of tilt. It has skipped a beat. This is the moment the rhythm changes, the moment the ice learns the power of inertia. It seems the glacier has developed a memory, a stubbornness that overrides the astronomical commands. It takes a tremendous amount of energy to build an ice sheet of this size. It is a project of 50, 60, 70,000 years. And once it is built, it possesses a thermal momentum that is nearly impossible to stop. It creates its own weather, its own high-pressure system that deflects the warm winds from the south, forcing them to go around, protecting its cold heart. We can imagine the frustration of the sun beating down on this white shield, trying to wake the Earth from its slumber, but failing year after year. The friction on the bedrock has created a hysteresis, a lag in the system where the effect persists long after the cause has vanished. The ice is no longer just responding to the climate, it is controlling it. There is a quiet, heavy majesty to this standoff. The glacier sits there, immobile, a vast, silent monument to the cold, while the forests to the south wait in vain for the retreat that does not come. Scientists still debate the exact physics of this stickiness, arguing over how much of the bed was truly frozen and how much was wet, sketching diagrams of friction coefficients on whiteboards in warm universities. But for the land itself, the experience was absolute. The weight was crushing. We often think of ice as brittle, something that shatters when you drop it. But under this kind of pressure, Ice behaves like a slow, viscous plastic, deforming and warping, yet at the base, where it grips the rock, it holds fast. It is like a heavy door that is rusted shut. It requires a much greater force to open it than it did to close it. This is why the 100,000-year cycle is so asymmetrical. It takes tens of thousands of years to build the ice, a slow, creeping accumulation of snow, but only a few thousand years to destroy it once the dam finally breaks. It is a slow inhale and a sharp, violent exhale. But here, in the middle of the growth phase, we are in the long inhale. The friction is holding the world in suspense. We can picture a single boulder torn from a mountain peak and carried deep inside the ice, now pressed against the bedrock at the bottom of the world. It grinds slowly, moving perhaps only a few inches a year, carving a deep groove into the stone, a signature that will be read by geologists 1,000,000 years later. That groove is the handwriting of the friction, the physical proof of the resistance that lengthened the ice ages. The atmosphere, too, is forced to bend around this new topography. The ice sheet is so high that it splits the jet stream, forcing the winds to flow around it, altering the storm tracks that bring rain to the rest of the planet. The friction on the bedrock has consequences that ripple out to the equator, changing the monsoons in Africa and the dryness of the Amazon. It is a reminder that the Earth is a connected system. You cannot pin down the blanket in Canada without pulling it off the bed in the tropics. The stability of these friction-bound ice sheets meant that the Earth spent more time in the cold state than in the warm. The interglacials, the warm breaks like the one we enjoy now, became rare, precious accidents, occurring only when the orbital eccentricity, the tilt, and the wobble all aligned perfectly to pry the ice off the rock. For the rest of the time, the ice held on. It clung to the shield rock with the desperation of a drowning swimmer, refusing to let go, refusing to melt. There is a sense of endurance here, of a patience that borders on the geological. The ice is not evil, nor is it good. It is simply heavy, and it has found a way to use the roughness of the Earth to its advantage. As we drift away from the dark interface of rock and ice, rising back up through the translucent blue layers, we feel the chill radiating outward, a cold that has seeped into the bones of the planet. The friction has bought the ice time to grow, time to thicken, and time to change the chemistry of the air itself. For as the ice grew taller and stayed longer, it began to work in concert with the oceans to draw down the heat-trapping gases of the atmosphere, locking the door from the inside. The physical grip on the bedrock was about to be reinforced by a chemical grip on the sky, a double lock that would ensure the deep freeze lasted for 100 millennia. The silence of the friction is the silence of a world waiting, holding its breath anchored to the stone while the stars wheel overhead, their signals ignored, their warmth reflected back into the void by the stubborn, unyielding white. The air is changing now, becoming clearer, sharper, and infinitely more brittle, as if the atmosphere itself has been polished by the cold until it is as transparent as a lens. We are drifting away from the physical weight of the ice, moving into the invisible, ghostly realm of chemistry, where the true secret of the long winter is hidden not in the mountains, but in the molecules. For millions of years, the Earth has wrapped itself in a delicate, invisible blanket of carbon dioxide, a greenhouse layer that traps the heat of the sun and keeps the planet warm enough for liquid water and life. It is a comfortable, familiar embrace, a thermal regulator that has smoothed out the rough edges of the climate since the days of the dinosaurs. But as the mid-Pleistocene transition takes hold, as the ice sheets anchor themselves to the bedrock and the rhythm of the tilt fades into the background, the Earth begins to do something strange. It begins to exhale. It begins to strip off its own blanket. The levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere start to fall, dropping lower than they have been for eons, thinning out the insulation just when the world needs it most. It feels like a betrayal, a sabotage from within. If you were standing on the tundra during this time, you would not see the carbon disappearing, but you would feel it in the bite of the wind, in the way the heat of the day evaporates instantly the moment the sun sets, escaping straight up into the void of space without anything to catch it. The greenhouse is breaking down, the glass is shattering. To understand where the carbon went, we must look to the oceans, the great heaving lungs of the planet. Water has a memory for gas, and it follows a simple cold rule. The colder it gets, the more gas it can hold. Think of a bottle of soda left out in the sun. It goes flat quickly, releasing its bubbles into the air. But a bottle kept in the icebox holds its fizz, keeping the gas trapped tight within the liquid. As the great ice sheets of the north grew larger and the global temperature began to dip, the oceans cooled. The surface waters, chilled by the winds blowing off the glaciers, became hungry for carbon. They began to absorb it from the atmosphere, sucking it down in vast invisible gulps, pulling the heat-trapping gas out of the sky and locking it away in the deep, dark currents of the abyss. This is the solubility pump, a mechanism as relentless as gravity. But there was likely another player in this silent theft, a connection to the violence we witnessed on the continents. Remember the dust? The rock flour ground from the bedrock by the friction of the ice? That fine, mineral-rich powder did not just vanish. The winds carried it out over the oceans, scattering iron and nutrients onto the waves like a farmer sowing seeds. This dust fertilized the plankton, the microscopic forests of the sea, causing them to bloom in explosions of life. These tiny creatures drank in the carbon dioxide to build their bodies, and when they died, they rained down into the deep ocean like a slow, continuous snowfall of carbon, taking the warmth of the atmosphere with them to the bottom of the world. It was a perfect self-reinforcing trap. The ice ground the rock fed the ocean scrubbed the sky, and the clearer sky made the world colder, allowing the ice to grow even larger. It is a loop of terrifying efficiency. Scientists studying the ice cores from Antarctica, those frozen time capsules drilled from miles beneath the surface, can see this happen. They see the bubbles of ancient air trapped in the ice, and they measure the carbon dioxide. During the warm times of the 41,000-year cycle, the levels were high. But as the 100,000-year world emerged, the floor dropped out. The minimum levels of CO2 during the ice ages fell lower and lower, crossing a critical threshold. It was as if the Earth's thermostat had been dialed down to a setting that had not been used in millions of years. This thinning of the atmosphere provided the second lock on the door. The first lock was the physical friction of the ice on the bedrock, keeping the glaciers from sliding away. The second lock was the chemical poverty of the air, ensuring that even if the summer sun was strong, the atmosphere was too thin to hold the heat. The sun's energy would strike the Earth and bounce right back out into space, rejected by a planet that had turned its back on warmth. This is why the 100,000-year cycles became so deep and so stable. The system had reinforced itself. It was no longer just about the orbit. It was about the atmosphere conspiring with the ice. The radiative forcing, the power of the atmosphere to retain heat, had weakened, leaving the planet exposed to the full raw cold of the universe. There is a fragility in this realization. We tend to think of the air as infinite, as a permanent backdrop. But here we see it as a variable, a fluctuating number that can be drained away by the ocean's hunger. The atmosphere grew thinner, not in density but in capacity, losing its ability to protect the surface from the chill of the vacuum. The creatures of the Earth were now living in a world with less insulation, a world where the margin for error was razor thin. If the sun blinked, if a volcano erupted and blocked the light, the cold would be instant and unforgiving. The Earth had become a high-sensitivity system, reacting dramatically to small changes because it had lost its buffer. It is quiet here in the thin air, a silence that feels distinct from the heavy silence of the ice. It is the silence of an empty room, of a house where the furniture has been removed. The molecules that once danced and vibrated with heat are gone, buried in the mud of the ocean floor, leaving behind a sky that is beautiful, crystalline, and deadly. The stars look brighter now, piercing through the dry, cold atmosphere with a hard brilliance, watching a world that is slowly turning into a white reflector, a mirror of ice. The transition is now fully underway, driven by the dual engines of friction and chemistry, and the planet is settling into a long, deep hibernation. The air is clear, the view is endless, and the warmth is a memory fading into the geological past. We breathe in the cold, feeling it settle in our own lungs, a connection to the ancestors who first felt this sharpening of the wind, and we understand that the rules of survival have changed again. The blanket is gone, the fire is low, and the long night of the 100,000 years is closing in. We leave the thin, shivering air behind now, slipping beneath the gray, restless waves to enter a world where the wind never blows, and the light of the sun is nothing more than a forgotten rumor. We are descending into the abyss, into the deep, crushing midnight of the global ocean, a place where the history of the climate is written not in ice or dust, but in the slow, silent currents of heavy water. If the atmosphere is the Earth's mood, quick to anger and quick to calm, then the ocean is its memory, a vast liquid archive that holds onto the past with a stubborn refusal to let go. Down here, in the bathypelagic zone and deeper still, time moves at a different speed. A drop of water that sinks in the North Atlantic might not see the surface again for 1,000 years, traveling on a slow, lonely pilgrimage along the bottom of the world before resurfacing in the Pacific. It is this slowness, this deep, dragging inertia that becomes the third and final key to the mystery of the 100,000-year cycle. As the mid-Pleistocene transition took hold, the architecture of the ocean began to change. In the warmer days of the 41,000-year rhythm, the ocean was a more vigorous mixer. The currents churned with a healthy appetite, bringing deep water up to the surface to breathe, releasing its trapped carbon dioxide back into the air and sending warm surface water down to heat the depths. The ocean conveyor belt, as we call it today, was running at a brisk pace, keeping the planet's temperature relatively uniform. But as the ice sheets on land grew tall and the atmosphere grew thin, the ocean responded by shutting its doors. Specifically, the waters around Antarctica, the Southern Ocean, the wild, storm-tossed ring of sea that circles the bottom of the globe, began to freeze over more extensively than before. This cap of sea ice acted like a lid on a pot. It prevented the deep carbon-rich water from rising up and exhaling its greenhouse gases. Simultaneously, the water that did manage to sink became colder and saltier, and therefore denser. It was heavy water, water that wanted to sit at the very bottom of the basin and stay there. A stratification settled over the oceans, a separation of the layers. The deep abyss became a stagnant, isolated pool, cut off from the world above. It became a cold storage vault. This deep water sat there, hoarding its carbon, hoarding its cold, refusing to mix with the warmer, lighter water near the surface. It was as if the ocean had decided to keep the winter for itself. This phenomenon is often described by paleoceanographers as the stratification of the abyss, a phrase that evokes a sense of ordered, heavy silence. The significance of this cannot be overstated. By locking away the deep water, the Earth effectively removed a massive source of heat and carbon from the equation. The ocean was no longer helping to warm the planet, it was helping to refrigerate it. And because this deep water moved so slowly, once it turned cold, it stayed cold. It created a thermal inertia that anchored the climate in the glacial state. Even if the summer sun up in the northern hemisphere tried to melt the ice sheets, the deep ocean would whisper, "No." It held on to the chill of the previous millennium, a vast thermal flywheel that kept the system sluggish. Imagine a giant submerged battery that stores cold instead of electricity. Once it is fully charged, it takes an enormous amount of energy to drain it. The 100,000-year cycle, therefore, is partly a story of the ocean's refusal to forget. The deep currents remembered the ice age long after the orbital triggers had passed. They acted as a dampener, smoothing out the shorter flickers of the sun, ignoring the quick 41,000-year pulses, and only responding to the massive combined push of the long cycle. Scientists still debate exactly which switch flipped first. Did the atmosphere cool the ocean, or did the ocean cool the atmosphere? A question that loops like a current itself, but the result was a unified front of cold. The creatures of the deep, the blind fish and the transparent jellies navigating the pressure, lived in a world that had become more stable, but also more isolated. The nutrients that used to well up from the bottom to feed the surface became trapped below the boundary layer, potentially altering the food webs in ways we are only just beginning to reconstruct from the fossil shells of microscopic foraminifera. These tiny shells, buried in the mud, show a chemical signature that speaks of a dying circulation, a slowing of the pulse. It is a somber image, the great global heart of the ocean beating slower and slower and slower. The water grew old. In oceanographic terms, old water is water that has been away from the surface for a long time, depleting its oxygen and collecting carbon. During the depths of the new, long ice ages, the water at the bottom of the Pacific was very old indeed, a vintage brewed in the darkness of a frozen world. This sluggish ocean completed the trap. We had the friction on the land holding the ice sheets in place. We had the thinning atmosphere starving the planet of heat. And now we had the stratified ocean hoarding the cold in the deep. The three systems, lithosphere, atmosphere, hydrosphere, had locked arms. They had formed a feedback loop of immense power, a self-sustaining machine designed to build ice. The transition was no longer just a shift in the wind. It was a restructuring of the planetary anatomy. The Earth had changed its metabolism. It had become a slow-burning creature, capable of enduring long periods of dormancy, storing its energy, suppressing its warmth. As we float in this dark, heavy suspension, feeling the weight of 4 kilometers of water above us, we can sense the profound stability of this new state. It feels almost permanent. The chaotic, jittery climate of the past has been smoothed out into these long, somber movements, like a piece of music that is slowed down until the notes are minutes apart. The ocean's memory is long, and in this era, it is remembering only the ice. It holds the cold close to its chest, protecting it from the sun, ensuring that when the glaciers finally do break, the collapse will be violent and absolute. But until then, the silence of the deep reigns supreme. We are drifting through a library of cold, surrounded by water that has forgotten the taste of the air, waiting for the great overturning that is still tens of thousands of years away. The system is set. The stage is fully dressed for the era of the giants. The ocean, the air, and the land are now moving as one, breathing in the slow, heavy rhythm of the 100,000 years. We rise from the crushing dark of the abyss, breaking the surface of the water under a sky that has turned a pale, steely gray, to witness the arrival of the new reality. We have spent time examining the gears of the machine, the friction of the stone, the thinning of the air, the slowing of the currents. But now we must step back to look at the machine itself as it begins to run. This is the era where the hesitation ends and the commitment begins, the time when the Earth finally surrenders to the long, deep rhythm of the 100,000-year cycle. Scientists call this period the mid-Pleistocene transition, a name that sounds dry and dusty, like a label in a museum drawer. But to live through it would have been to witness the birth of a great winter, a season so long that it swallows history whole. Imagine being a creature born at the beginning of this freeze. You live your life, you grow old, you pass away, and the winter has not changed. Your children do the same. And their children, and their children's children, for 1,000 generations. The ice does not merely visit, it moves in, it settles. It becomes the landscape itself, as permanent as the mountains and the sea. The transition was the moment when the skippable summers began to occur. In the old rhythm, every time the Earth tilted towards the sun, the ice melted. But now, thanks to the anchors we have discussed, the ice sheets had become strong enough to survive the first pulse of warmth. The tilt would increase, the sun would brighten, and the glaciers would simply shrug it off, sitting safely in their fortresses of cold air and high albedo reflection. The warm cycle would pass, unfulfilled, and the Earth would slide back into the dark side of the wobble without ever having thawed. It was a skipped beat, a missing summer in the geological record. Then, the cold would deepen further, adding another 40,000 years of snow on top of what was already there. The ice sheets grew from local giants into continental monsters, bridging the gap between one orbital cycle and the next, stitching them together into a single, seamless tapestry of white. This is how the 100,000-year cycle was born, not by a new force appearing in the sky, but by the Earth learning to ignore the command to melt. It merged the smaller beats into a longer, heavier measure. The result was a world of profound, aching beauty and terrifying stillness. The chaos of the transition years, the stuttering climate, the confusion of the signals, slowly smoothed out into this long, low hum. We can imagine standing on a ridge in what is now Central Europe, looking north. In the distance, the horizon is not a line of blue or green, but a wall of white that rises up to touch the clouds. It is the edge of the Scandinavian ice sheet, a mass so large it has its own gravity, pulling the mantle of the Earth down, depressing the crust by hundreds of meters. The wind blowing off this face is katabatic, heavy cold air that pours down the slopes like invisible water, freezing everything in its path. The trees have retreated. The lush, mixed forests of the early Pleistocene are gone, replaced by the mammoth steppe, a vast, dry grassland that stretches from France to Siberia, a single biome circling the top of the world. It is a dry cold, for the oceans are locked away and the air holds little moisture. The snow that falls is hard and gritty, like diamond dust scouring the land. This is the signature of the great winter. It is an arid, windy, dusty world. The sun shines with a fierce, blinding glare off the snow, but it carries no heat. The light is deceptive. It looks like noon, but it feels like midnight. The passage of time in this era feels different, stretched thin. Without the regular, reliable reset of the 41,000-year melt, the accumulation of history becomes heavy. We can see it in the layers of the ice itself, recording year after year of dust and isotopes, a library of cold that grows thicker by the century. The sawtooth pattern of the climate graph becomes the dominant shape of the future, a slow, jagged, agonizingly long descent into the deepest cold, lasting tens of thousands of years, followed by a sudden, violent, brief recovery. We are currently in the descent. The Earth is sliding down the long slope of the sawtooth. The animals of this time are the survivors, the ones who could adapt to a home that never thaws. We see the woolly rhinoceros, the cave lion, the ancestors of the Neanderthals, all evolved to handle the stress of a forever winter. They are creatures of the cold, wearing their fur and their fat like armor. They do not expect the world to change. To them, the ice is not an anomaly. It is the state of the universe. The concept of a warm world is a genetic memory, a dream written in their instincts, but unseen in their lifetimes. The mid-Pleistocene transition was the bottleneck through which life had to pass, a filter that screened out the fragile and the specialized, leaving only the robust. It was a cruel time, a time of extinction for the plants that could not move fast enough and the beasts that could not grow warm enough. But for the planet itself, it was a settling. The systems had found their new equilibrium. The atmosphere, the ocean, and the ice had agreed on a pact of stability. It is strange to think that this era, this long freeze, is actually the normal state of the Pleistocene. The warm moments, the interglacials, like the Holocene we live in now, are the freaks, the fever spikes, the brief holidays in a life of labor. The great winter is the rule. We are the exception. Standing here in the depths of the first true long cycle, we feel the weight of that realization. The ice is not an invader. It is the landlord. It has claimed the northern hemisphere, and it intends to stay. The silence is absolute, broken only by the cracking of the glacier as it shifts its weight, a sound like a cannon shot that rolls across the dry steppe for miles unanswered. The sun sets early, dipping below the wall of white, and the sky turns a deep bruised purple. The stars emerge, the same stars that watched the dinosaurs, but now they look down on a planet that has turned its face away from the fire. The transition is complete. The mystery of the why has been answered by the mechanics of the how, friction, carbon, ocean, but the experience of the what is just beginning. The giants of the north have awoken, and they are hungry for land. They will not stop growing until they have altered the rotation of the Earth, until they have drunk the oceans down, until they have squeezed life into the narrow margins of the equator. The great winter has been born, and it has a long, long time to run before it sleeps again. We wrap our minds around this scale, this 100,000-year breath, and we feel small, fragile, and temporary, exactly as we should. The night has fully fallen, and the ice is awake. We have spoken of the ice as a blanket, as a weight, and as a lock, but to truly understand the scale of the 100,000-year winter, we must learn to see the ice as a mountain range, a geological feature so massive that it rivals the Himalayas, yet built entirely of frozen water. We are traveling now to the very heart of the North American continent, to the place we now call Canada, though in this time the land is utterly gone, buried beneath a structure known as the Laurentide ice sheet. It is difficult for the human mind to grasp the sheer vertical audacity of this thing. We are not talking about a thin layer of frost glazing the fields. We're talking about a dome of ice that rises 3, perhaps 4 kilometers into the sky. Imagine standing in the streets of modern-day Chicago or Toronto and looking up, not at the clouds, but at a wall of white that ascends past the height of the tallest skyscrapers, past the flight paths of small aircraft, rising until it thins into the stratosphere. It is a ghost mountain, a phantom peak that existed for thousands of years and then vanished into water, leaving only the shadow of its weight impressed upon the crust. To stand on the summit of the Laurentide in this era is to stand on a planet within a planet. The air here is thin and oxygen-starved, stinging the lungs with a purity that feels extraterrestrial. The horizon is a perfect, unbroken circle of blinding white, a desert of ice that stretches from the Atlantic to the Rockies, a flat, shimmering plateau where the curvature of the earth is the only limit to your vision. There is no life here. No birds fly this high, no pollen drifts on the wind. It is a place of absolute crystalline solitude, a cathedral of silence raised by the slow accumulation of snowflakes over millennia. But this giant is not just a passive monument, it is an active force, a bully in the playground of the atmosphere. For millions of years, the winds of the earth, the great westerly currents that carry heat and moisture around the globe, had flowed in a relatively straight line, a river of air moving comfortably from west to east. But now, the river finds a dam. The jet stream, that high-altitude serpent of wind that steers the storms, encounters the physical barrier of the ice sheet. It cannot go through it. It cannot easily go over it. So it is forced to bend. It splits. Like a stream striking a boulder, the airflow is deflected, forced to detour thousands of miles to the south. This is the moment the ice begins to rewrite the weather map of the entire world. The storms that used to water the forests of the north are shoved downward, bringing rain and coolness to lands that were once dry. The American Southwest, the deserts of Utah and Nevada, are suddenly bathed in moisture, transforming into lush lake-filled oases where great beasts come to drink. We can imagine the confusion of the wind, the way the currents of the air must navigate this new, alien topography, forced to bow down before the majesty of the frozen water. This deflection protects the ice sheet itself, wrapping it in a bubble of cold, dry air, an anticyclone of immense power. High pressure settles over the dome like a heavy hand, pushing the clouds away, ensuring that the sun strikes only the reflective white surface, bouncing harmlessly back into space. The giant creates its own shield. It has engineered a way to starve itself of heat while feeding itself with cold. And then, there are the winds that are born on the ice itself. Gravity, ever the patient worker, pulls at the dense, heavy air sitting on top of the dome. This air, chilled to temperatures that would freeze flesh in seconds, begins to roll downhill. It gathers speed, sliding down the long, sloping flanks of the glacier, accelerating until it becomes a screaming gale, a katabatic wind that pours off the edge of the ice sheet and scours the lands below. These winds are the breath of the giant. They blast the plains of Europe and America, drying out the soil, blowing away the trees, creating the vast, dusty steppe where the woolly mammoths roam. It is a harsh, howling environment, a place where the wind is never still, where the dust of the ground is constantly in motion, driven by the exhale of the ice. The trees cannot stand against it. They are toppled or buried, replaced by the resilient grasses that can bend and survive. We see the landscape submitting to this new master, the topography of the vegetation shaped not by the rain, but by the wind coming off the north. The Fennoscandian giant covering northern Europe does the same, joining hands with its American cousin to squeeze the westerly winds into a narrow, furious belt that whips across the Atlantic. The ocean, too, feels the lash of these winds, churning with a violence that mixes the water and cools it further. It seems almost mythical, this battle between the air and the ice, a struggle between the fluid and the frozen. The ice sheet acts like a white shield, deflecting the warmth of the tropics, refusing to let it penetrate the high latitudes. It is a rejection of the sun's gift. Scientists often wonder just how high these domes truly reached, whether they were smooth, gentle humps or jagged, chaotic ridges, using computer models to try and reconstruct the lost geography of the sky. But the wind knows the truth. The wind remembers the wall. It remembers having to climb, having to divert, having to carry the dust of a pulverized continent halfway around the world. The existence of these giants meant that the weather in the south, in the Mediterranean, in California, in China, was intimately tied to the height of a glacier in Winnipeg or Stockholm. A few hundred meters of growth in the north could shift a rain belt 500 miles in the south, collapsing a civilization or birthing a desert. The connectivity is profound. The giant does not need to move to make its presence felt. It simply stands there, blocking the sky, and the rest of the world must adjust its steps to accommodate it. There is a sense of awe in this, a realization that water, the most yielding of substances, can become a mountain strong enough to break the wind. The 100,000-year mystery is not just about time, it is about architecture. It is about the Earth building temporary continents of ice that alter the flow of the planetary fluids. As we drift along the edge of this white cliff, watching the katabatic winds kick up plumes of snow that glitter like diamond dust in the pale sunlight, we feel the raw power of the transition. The gentle, rhythmic world is gone. This is a world of extremes, of high walls and deep valleys, of fierce winds and dead calms. The giants have taken their seats at the table, and they are dictating the conversation. The atmosphere has been forced into a new pattern, a loop of cold reinforcing cold, and the wind, once the bringer of change, has become the servant of the stasis, circling the fortress, protecting the king, ensuring that the winter remains undisturbed, locked in the high, thin air of the Ice Age zenith. The wind dies down as we descend from the heights of the ice plateau, slipping away from the screaming gales of the summit to press our ears against the ground itself, listening for the deepest sound in the world. We have seen how the ice changed the sky, bending the winds and stealing the moisture. But now we must witness what it did to the stone beneath it. We tend to think of the Earth's crust, the rocky shell we walk upon, as a solid, unyielding floor, a foundation that never moves unless an earthquake tears it apart. But under the scale of the 100,000-year winter, under the unimaginable tonnage of the Laurentide and Fennoscandian giants, the Earth is not solid at all. It is elastic. It is pliable. It behaves less like rock and more like a thick, heavy memory foam, or a raft floating on a slow-moving sea of magma. As the ice sheets thickened, stacking kilometer upon kilometer of frozen water onto the continents, the sheer weight became too much for the crust to bear. Imagine placing a heavy bowling ball onto the center of a soft mattress. The fabric dips, the springs compress, and a depression forms, drawing everything towards the center. This is exactly what happened to the continents of the Northern Hemisphere. They began to sink. It was a slow, agonizing descent, a geological bow of submission to the power of the water. The land of Canada, of Scandinavia, of Northern Europe, was pressed down, pushed deeper into the mantle of the planet by hundreds of meters. If you were able to drain the ice away instantly in a magic trick of physics, you would have found that the land was no longer where it used to be. It was a vast, bowl-shaped depression, a hollowed-out basin where the mountains had been brought low and the plains had been crushed into valleys. This process is called isostasy, a beautiful word derived from the Greek for equal standstill, describing the balance the earth seeks to maintain. But there was nothing still about this compression. It was a slow-motion crushing. Deep beneath the crust, in the hot, viscous red layer of the mantle, the semi-molten rock was being squeezed away. Like toothpaste being squeezed out of a tube, or dough being pressed by a baker's thumb, the mantle material flowed sideways, escaping the pressure of the ice above. This flowing rock had to go somewhere, and so it pushed up the land around the edges of the ice sheets, creating a phenomenon known as the forebulge. While the center of the continent sank into the depths, the peripheral lands, areas like the southern United States or the southern expanses of the North Sea, began to rise, lifted up on a crest of displaced stone. It was a seesaw of continental proportions, a slow, rhythmic flexing of the Earth's skin. We can imagine the strange, silent violence of this pressure. The rocks themselves, brittle and cold, groaned under the stress. Ancient faults that had been asleep for millions of years were woken up, slipping and grinding in the dark, triggering glacial earthquakes that rippled through the ice in the soil, unnoticed by any living soul, shocks born not of tectonic drift, but of sheer crushing weight. The landscape was being reshaped not by erosion, but by deformation. The rivers that flowed north were suddenly confused, finding their paths blocked not just by ice, but by the fact that the ground itself was tilting against them, the slope they had followed for eons reversed by the sinking of the crust. Huge lakes formed in these depressions, trapped between the wall of the ice and the upward slope of the forebulge, bodies of water that would dwarf the Great Lakes of today, holding the meltwater in vast cold reservoirs that waited for a chance to escape. It is a somber thought to realize that the ground is so temporary, so responsive to the burden it carries. The solid earth is really just a floating skin, sensitive to the distribution of mass on its surface. The 100,000-year cycle, with its massive heavy ice sheets, turned the planet into a pulsating, breathing shape, expanding and contracting, rising and falling with the rhythm of the climate. The ice was not just covering the land, it was rewriting the topography. It was pushing the crust down so far that parts of the continent were actually below sea level, kept dry only by the walls of ice that held back the ocean. If the ice had shattered then, the sea would have rushed in to flood the heart of the land, turning continents into archipelagos. But the ice held firm, a heavy lid on the depressed jar of the crust. This sinking had a profound effect on the stability of the ice itself. As the land sank, the surface of the ice sheet lowered as well, bringing the top of the glacier down into slightly warmer air, a subtle feedback loop that might have eventually helped to melt it. But for thousands of years, the depression simply allowed the ice to anchor itself deeper, like a root growing into the soil. The pressure was absolute. We can visualize the molecules of the rock at the bottom of the pile, compressed, heated by the friction of the mantle moving below, trapped in a vise between the fire of the core and the ice of the surface. It is a place of intense, silent potential energy. And even today, we are living with the memory of this weight. In places like Hudson Bay and the Gulf of Bothnia, the land is still rising, springing back up in slow motion from the release of the ice that melted 10,000 years ago. The Earth has a long memory. It does not forget the pressure easily. It is still rebounding, still exhaling after holding its breath for so long. But back in the depths of the cycle, there was no release, only the relentless addition of more snow, more weight, more pressure. The land bowed until it could bow no further, reaching a point of isostatic equilibrium where the upward push of the mantle finally matched the downward crush of the ice. There, in that standoff, the world froze. The mountains were shorter, the valleys were deeper, and the shape of the continents was distorted, bent out of recognition by the load they carried. It feels humbling to stand on the ground now, knowing it is essentially a spring that has been coiled and uncoiled by the weather. The landscape we see is not a fixed sculpture, but a snapshot in a moving film, a frame frozen in the middle of a long recovery. The 100,000-year cycle did not just change the temperature, it changed the elevation. It turned the solid earth into a fluid player in the drama, forcing the stone to dance to the rhythm of the water. The mystery of the ice ages is thus a mystery of weight, of how a substance as light and fleeting as a snowflake can, given enough time and enough friends, become heavy enough to sink a continent. The depression of the crust is the physical footprint of the giant, a dent left in the pillow of the world that tells us, without words, just how heavy the winter truly was. We walk gently here, knowing that beneath our feet the mantle is still slowly flowing back to where it belongs, repairing the damage, healing the bruise left by the great crushing embrace of the ice. The wind that scours the depressed frozen continents is not merely a force of erosion, it is a sculptor of flesh and bone, a silent, demanding artist that reshapes the living world to fit the new, brutal geometry of the ice. We turn our gaze now from the sinking stone and the towering glaciers to the vast open theater that lies at their feet, a landscape that has no modern equivalent, a biome that vanished when the world grew warm again. This is the Mammoth Steppe, a seemingly endless ocean of dry, nutrient-rich grasses and herbs that stretches across the top of the world, from the Atlantic coast of Europe, across the plains of Russia and Siberia, over the land bridge, and down into the heart of North America. It is a cold world, yes, bitterly so, but it is not empty. In fact, it is teeming with life. But life that has been transformed, exaggerated, and insulated against the 100,000-year winter. To survive here, biology had to solve a simple problem of thermodynamics: how to keep a small fire burning in a very large, very cold room. The solution was size. As the deep freeze lengthened and the winters stretched into eons, the animals of the Pleistocene began to grow. This is the era of the megafauna, the giants who walked the earth like living fortresses. We see the woolly mammoth not as a monster, but as a miracle of engineering. Standing in the pale, slanted light, it is a creature built entirely for heat retention. Its ears are small, tucked close to its head to prevent frostbite and heat loss, a stark contrast to the vast fan-like ears of its African cousins who need to cool down. Its body is covered in a triple layer of defense, a thick layer of subcutaneous fat to insulate the organs, a dense undercoat of fine wool to trap air against the skin, and a shaggy outer guard hair, sometimes a meter long, to shed the snow and break the wind. It is a walking mountain of warmth, but the mammoth is not alone. Beside it, pushing through the drifts with a horn flattened like a shovel to sweep away the snow, is the woolly rhinoceros, a tank of muscle and hair that seems almost mythical to our eyes, yet was as real and common as a cow is today. There are elk with antlers spanning 12 feet, deer the size of horses, and beavers the size of black bears. This trend towards gigantism is known to science as Bergmann's rule, a principle which states that in colder climates, bodies grow larger because a large body has less surface area relative to its volume, meaning it loses heat more slowly. The 100,000-year cycle, with its relentless, enduring cold, pushed this logic to its absolute limit. It selected for the big, the round, and the heavy. The smaller, slender creatures of the warm past were winnowed away, replaced by these bulky survivors who could carry their own furnaces within them. The landscape they inhabited was a paradox. We might imagine the Ice Age as a time of deep snow and starvation, yet the Mammoth Steppe was actually a productive, fertile place during the short, intense summers. The dry air meant that snow cover was often thin, allowing the animals to reach the grass beneath, and the grinding of the glaciers provided a constant supply of mineral dust that fertilized the soil. It was a golden, grassy Serengeti of the north, supporting herds that numbered in the millions. But the price of admission was the ability to endure the long, dark winter. Evolution worked not just on the bodies, but on the behaviors. The animals learned to move, to migrate across vast distances in sync with the retreating and advancing ice, a rhythmic sloshing of biomass across the continents. They learned to slow their metabolisms, to huddle, to use the group as a shield against the solitary cold. We can imagine the steam rising from a herd of bison standing shoulder to shoulder in a blizzard, a collective warmth that defies the temperature of the air. Even the predators had to adapt. The cave lion, larger than any lion alive today, prowled these steppes, a ghost in the grass hunting the giants. The cave. Hyena, with jaws capable of crushing the femur of a mammoth, acted as the grim undertaker of the ecosystem, ensuring that nothing was wasted in a world where energy was the most precious currency. There is a strange intimacy in this ecosystem, a tight-knit web of life huddled together on the strip of habitable land between the ice sheets and the deserts. It feels like a community under siege, bound together by the necessity of the cold. The silence of the steppe is broken by the low infrasonic rumble of the mammoths, a sound that travels for miles through the ground, a communication network that binds the families together across the horizon. They are discussing the location of water, the movement of the storm, the presence of the lions. It is a conversation that has been going on for tens of thousands of years, a language of survival spoken in the deep bass notes of the throat. And yet, there is a vulnerability here too. These giants are specialized. They are built for a specific world, a world of dry, cold, and open grass. They are the children of the 100,000-year cycle, crafted by its specific demands. If the world were to change quickly, if the air were to become wet and warm, if the forests were to return and the hard ground turn to marsh, their heavy coats would become suffocating cloaks, and their massive bodies would sink into the mud. They are masters of the freeze, but they are prisoners of it as well. Evolution has painted them into a corner, a beautiful, white, frozen corner. We watch a young mammoth calf playing in the snow, tossing a tuft of dry grass into the air, unaware that its species is walking a tightrope. It seems so permanent, this empire of fur and ivory, so perfectly adapted that it could last forever. But the climate is a wheel that never stops turning. The very specialization that keeps them alive in the winter makes them fragile in the face of the thaw. The deep time perspective allows us to see them not as monsters, but as tragic heroes, optimized for a harsh reality that is, unbeknownst to them, temporary. The 100,000-year cycle created them, sculpted them from the clay of their ancestors, and gave them dominion over the north, but it also set the clock ticking on their reign. For now, however, they are the kings and queens of the steppe. The wind ruffles their long hair, the frost coats their eyelashes, and they breathe in the cold air with lungs the size of beer kegs, seemingly invincible in their adaptation. They are the living answer to the question the ice asked. How do you survive the long night? You grow big, you grow together, you grow warm. And as we watch them drift slowly across the pale, frozen plain, vanishing into the mist of the gathered breath of the herd, we feel a pang of recognition, for there is another creature moving into this landscape, a smaller, shivering, naked ape that has no fur, no claws, and no great size, yet is about to challenge the giants for the title of the ultimate survivor. The stage is set for a meeting between the biological insulation of the mammoth and the technological insulation of the human, a meeting that will define the final chapter of the Pleistocene. In the shadow of the great white walls, amidst the stomping of the woolly giants and the howling of the katabatic winds, there is a movement so small and fragile, it seems impossible that it could survive the night, let alone the epoch. We turn our lens now to the most unlikely of the Ice Age survivors, a creature that possesses neither the fur of the mammoth nor the claws of the lion, a creature that is, by all biological rights, a tropical animal lost in a frozen world. We see them huddled in the mouth of a shallow limestone cave, a small knot of shivering bodies pressed together against the encroaching dark. These are the wandering ancestors, the early humans, perhaps Homo heidelbergensis, or the early Neanderthals, or the first brave bands of our own kind, who have found themselves locked in the cage of the 100,000-year cycle. They are naked, essentially, their skin thin and soft, their limbs lacking the terrifying strength of the bear. Yet they are here, watching the snow fall with eyes that burn with a strange, calculating intelligence. The story of the Ice Ages is often told through the movement of glaciers, but it is also the story of how the cold forged the human mind. The long, punishing rhythm of the climate did not just shape the land, it shaped us. It forced a crisis of adaptation. When the world was warm and stable, instinct was enough. You ate the fruit that grew on the same trees your parents ate from. You slept in the same valleys. But in the era of the giant swings, when the forests turned to steppes, and the steppes turned to deserts, and the deserts turned to ice, instinct was a trap. To survive, you had to learn to remember. You had to learn to predict. The fire that flickers in the center of their circle is not just a source of heat, it is their rebellion against the climate. It is a captured piece of the sun, fed with dry moss and splintered bone, a technology that allows them to carry a tropical microclimate with them into the heart of the winter. We can smell the acrid, greasy smoke of a burning bone, a scent that permeates their hair and their seal-hide cloaks, the perfume of survival. They sit in silence, working with their hands, and the sound of stone striking stone, clack, 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 is the rhythm of their resilience. They are knapping flint, turning the raw rock of the earth into tools that can cut through the thick hide of a rhino or scrape the flesh from a bone. It is a slow, rhythmic work that requires patience and foresight, the ability to see the tool hidden inside the stone before a single chip is removed. This capacity for future thinking is the gift of the ice. The cold punishes the impulsive. It kills those who do not plan. If you do not gather wood before the blizzard, you die. If you do not sew the skins together tightly enough, you die. If you do not remember where the herds migrate when the seasons change, you die. The 100,000-year cycle acted as a ruthless filter, weeding out the forgetful and the solitary, selecting for those who could hold a map of the world in their heads and a network of loyalty in their hearts. We imagine them as brutes, grunting and clubbing, but the truth is likely far softer and more complex. They were master observers, naturalists of the highest order who knew the behavior of the wind and the habits of the wolf better than any modern scientist. They had to. Their lives depended on reading the subtle signs of the transition, the way the birds left early, the thickness of the beaver's fur, the changing color of the sky. They were the first creatures to feel the anxiety of time, the awareness that the present safety is fleeting and that a harder future is coming. This anxiety is what drove them to wander. As the ice sheets grew and the sea levels dropped, the geography of the world opened up in new and terrifying ways. The familiar hunting grounds would disappear under the ice, forcing the tribes to move, to push into the unknown, to cross mountain ranges and follow rivers that had no names. They became nomads not by choice, but by necessity, pushed around the map by the expanding lungs of the glaciers. We can see a small group cresting a ridge, looking out over a valley that no human eye has ever seen before, their breath steaming in the gray air, their burdens strapped to their backs with strips of sinew. They are tired. Their feet are callous and cracked, wrapped in dried grass and leather. They carry their children, who look out at the white world with wide, dark eyes, absorbing the lesson that life is movement. There's a profound loneliness in this image, a tiny speck of warmth moving through a landscape of indifference. But there is also a deep connection. They have each other. The harshness of the environment forced them to cooperate more deeply than any primate before them. A lone human on the mammoth steppe is a snack for a hyena. A group of humans with spears and fire is a force to be reckoned with. The social brain grew in the shadow of the ice. We shared food not just because we were kind, but because it was the only insurance policy against the bad luck of the hunt. We cared for the injured and the elderly. We see this in the fossil record, in the healed bones of those who could not have survived alone, because they held the wisdom, the memories of the last great freeze, the knowledge of how to survive when the world turns against you. It seems that the freeze thawed our capacity for empathy, binding us together in a tight knot of mutual reliance. Historians and anthropologists still argue about the exact paths they took, drawing arrows on maps that span continents, debating whether they hugged the coasts or braved the interior. But for the ancestors themselves, there were no arrows, only the horizon. There was only the question of what lay beyond the next hill. Was it a herd of bison? Was it a wall of ice? Was it a cave where the fire could sleep out of the wind? They were exploring a world that was constantly erasing itself. The landscape they walked through is gone now, drowned under the rising seas of the interglacial or buried under the silt of the rivers. But their journey remains written in our blood. We are the children of these wanderers. We carry their restlessness, their need to plan, their fear of the dark, and their obsession with fire. The 100,000-year cycle did not just challenge them, it made them. It took a tropical ape and tempered it in the forge of the north, turning it into a creature that could live anywhere, eat anything, and solve any problem. As the night deepens outside their cave and the wind picks up its mournful song, trying to snuff out their tiny flame, they move closer together, touching shoulders, a physical circle of warmth that keeps the terror at bay. One of them begins to hum, a low, rhythmic sound that mimics the heartbeat, a lullaby without words that speaks of safety and continuity. It is a sound that says, "We are still here. The ice has not taken us yet." They drift into sleep, a sleep that is light and alert, their dreams filled with the shapes of animals and the white glare of the sun on snow, waiting for the morning to bring another day of struggle, another day of walking, another day of enduring the long, beautiful, terrible mystery of the frozen earth. We drift now from the huddled warmth of the human cave out towards the edge of the world, only to find that the edge has moved, retreated, and vanished into the haze of distance. To understand the full scale of the 100,000-year winter, we must look not just at what was added to the land, the mountains of ice, but at what was subtracted from the sea. It is a simple equation of planetary plumbing. Every drop of water that is locked up in the frozen vaults of the Laurentide or Fennoscandian ice sheets is a drop of water that has been stolen from the ocean. As the giants grew mile by mile into the sky, they drank the oceans down, lowering the global sea level by a staggering 120 meters, the height of a 40-story building. If you were to stand on a beach in the mid-Pleistocene, you would be looking out not at the waves, but at a vast sloping plain of mud and new grass stretching out to a distant unseen shoreline. The continental shelves, those shallow rims that surround the land masses, were exposed to the air, transforming from seabeds into landscapes. This was the era of the ghost lands, the vanished subcontinents that existed only because the world was cold. The most famous of these, the legendary gateway between the old world and the new, is a place we call Beringia. In our modern imagination, we tend to picture this as a narrow, precarious strip of land, a land bridge that weary travelers hurried across before the tide came in, but the reality was far more majestic and permanent. Beringia was not a bridge, it was a country. It was a vast, low-lying territory as wide as Australia is tall, a subcontinent that connected Siberia and Alaska into a continuous, unbroken expanse of the Mammoth Steppe. It was not a place of transit, but a place of residence, a refuge where the grass grew tall and the winds swept the snow away, creating a sanctuary for the herds while the rest of the north was buried. We can imagine walking across this lost land, the ground beneath our feet spongy with tundra moss and hard with permafrost, the air smelling of sage and dry dust. To the north, the Arctic Ocean is a frozen sheet of white. To the south, the Pacific is miles away, a distant rumor. Here, in the middle of what is now the sea, the sun sets over a landscape of braided rivers and willow thickets, where the mammoths and the horses graze in peace, unaware that they are standing on the bottom of the ocean. It was here, scientists believe, that the ancestors of the Native Americans may have paused, perhaps for thousands of years, a period known as the Beringian standstill, living in this isolated pocket of habitability, their culture and genetics incubating in the middle of the bridge before the ice melted enough to let them south. It is a profound thought. The cradle of a new civilization was a land that no longer exists. But Beringia was not the only child of the low seas. On the other side of the world, between the island we now call Britain and the mainland of Europe, lay another vanished realm known as Doggerland. Today, the North Sea rolls cold and gray over this place, and trawlers drag their nets across the bottom, pulling up the bones of lions and the teeth of mammoths, confused fragments of a drowned world. But in the depths of the Ice Age, Doggerland was the heart of Europe. It was a rich, marshy plain where the great rivers, the Rhine, the Thames, the Seine, did not flow into the sea as they do now, but flowed together, merging into a single mighty super river that wound its way slowly towards the Atlantic. We can picture a hunter standing on the banks of this lost river, looking west towards a range of hills that we would recognize as the White Cliffs of Dover, only there is no channel of water separating them, just a continuous rolling valley of green. You could walk from London to Berlin without ever getting your feet wet. You could hunt deer in forests that are now oyster beds. It creates a strange sensation of vertigo to realize that the map we know, the familiar shapes of the continents with their ragged coastlines, is merely a snapshot of the high tide of the interglacial. The true map of the Pleistocene, the map that defined the world for 90% of human history, was blobby and connected, a world where the islands were joined to the mainland and the straits were closed. This connectivity changed the rules of life. Animals that had been separated for eons suddenly met. The exchange of species was constant. The wolves of Europe met the wolves of America. The humans of Asia walked east until they became the humans of the Americas. The lower sea levels also changed the climate of the tropics. In Southeast Asia, the shallow seas between the islands drained away to reveal a massive continent known as Sundaland, connecting Vietnam, Indonesia, and Borneo into a single humid jungle mass. This vast increase in land area changed the weather patterns of the entire Pacific, altering the monsoons and drying out the rainforests. The Earth was not just colder, it was physically larger, with more land exposed to the sun and wind than at any time in recent history. There is a melancholy beauty in walking these lost lands in our minds. We feel the flatness of the horizon, the sense of infinite space that comes from standing on a shelf that slopes so gently you cannot tell where the land ends and the sea begins. The light here seems different, filtered through the dry, dusty atmosphere of the glacial maximum. It is a world of quiet endurance. The waves are far away, their roar silenced by the distance, and the only sound is the wind hissing through the sedge grass and the cry of a lone eagle hunting over the dry bed of the North Sea. The humans who lived here did not know they were walking on borrowed time. They did not know that the ice sheets to the north were the only things keeping the ocean at bay. To them, this was simply the world, solid, reliable, and vast. They built their fires in the lee of dunes that are now sandbanks for fish. They buried their dead in soil that is now covered by 20 fathoms of salt water. The bridges were their home, their hunting grounds, their universe. It brings a sense of humility to our own understanding of geography. We build our cities on the coast, assuming the sea level is a fixed line, a permanent border between the wet and the dry. But the history of the 100,000-year cycle tells us that the coastline is a moving target, a temporary agreement between the ice and the ocean. The land we stand on is fluid, expanding and contracting with the rhythm of the climate. The existence of these bridges was the silver lining of the Great Freeze, the gift that the ice gave to life. It allowed the biosphere to mix, to migrate, to find new homes when the old ones became uninhabitable. The cold may have closed the door on the north, but it opened the door between the continents. As we stand in the center of Beringia, watching the aurora borealis dance over the white peaks of the distant Brooks Range, we feel a strange gratitude for the missing water. Without this theft, without the ocean retreating into the ice, the story of humanity would have been trapped in the old world, unable to spill over into the vast empty canvas of the Americas. The ice was the bridge builder. But deep down, we know the cycle must turn. The pendulum that swung towards the cold must eventually swing back. The water that is locked in the glaciers is not gone. It is merely waiting. It is stored potential energy, eager to return to its liquid state. The bridges are temporary, the ocean is patient. And as the 100,000-year cycle nears its end, as the orbital elements begin to align for the great release, the sea is preparing to reclaim its territory, to wash over the footprints of the ancestors and turn the plains back into the deep. The silence of the vanished seas is a heavy, expectant silence, a pause before the return of the tide. The silence of the 100,000-year winter, deep and heavy as it was, could not last forever, for the solar system is a clock that never stops ticking, and eventually, the tumblers of the great celestial lock fell into alignment once more. We are standing now at the precipice of the change, the moment when the long, slow inhale of the ice age turns into the sharp, violent exhale of the thaw. In the language of paleoclimatology, this event is called a termination, a word that carries a finality suited to the death of a world. It is the most dramatic feature of the climate record, the vertical cliff at the end of the sawtooth graph. It takes 90,000 years to build the ice sheets, layer by painful layer, but it takes only a few thousand years, a blink of a geological eye, to destroy them. The destruction begins with a conspiracy of light. The orbital cycles, which had been out of sync for so long, suddenly harmonize. The tilt of the Earth rocks back to its maximum, exposing the high northern latitudes to the direct gaze of the sun. The orbit, stretched by eccentricity, swings the planet closest to the solar fire right in the middle of the northern summer. The sun arrives not as a gentle guest, but as a conqueror. The air warms. The surface of the great white domes, which had reflected the light so perfectly for millennia, begins to change. Pools of meltwater form on the top of the plateau, turning the brilliant white snow into a deep sapphire blue. Blue absorbs heat. The shield is breached. The water does not just sit there. It burrows. It finds cracks and fissures in the ice, drilling down and spiraling terrifying waterfalls known as moulins, plunging 3 kilometers into the dark heart of the glacier. We can hear the sound of it, a roar that vibrates through the ice, the sound of the ocean invading the mountain. When this water hits the bottom, it hits the bedrock we spoke of earlier, the rock that had been gripping the ice with friction. But now, the water acts as a hydraulic jack. It lifts the ice sheet up just a fraction of an inch and lubricates the contact zone. The sticky phase is over. The ice, suddenly unmoored and slippery again, begins to surge. It is a moment of planetary chaotic motion. The edges of the Laurentide and Fennoscandian sheets do not melt politely. They collapse. Vast armadas of icebergs, some the size of small countries, break off into the North Atlantic, a phenomenon known as a Heinrich event. These fleets of white islands drift south, reaching as far as Portugal, melting and dumping their cargo of rocks and dust onto the ocean floor, leaving a trail of debris that tells us of the violence of the breakup. The ocean churns with the influx of cold, fresh water, disrupting the currents, causing the climate to flicker wildly, jumping from hot to cold and back again in the span of a single human lifetime. It is a time of weather whiplash, where a person might grow up hunting reindeer in the snow and die of old age gathering hazelnuts in a forest. But the true violence happens on the land. As the ice melts, it creates colossal lakes, vast inland seas of trapped water dammed up behind the retreating walls of the glaciers. These are not peaceful lakes, they are bombs waiting to detonate. Eventually, the ice dams fail. We can close our eyes and try to imagine the scale of the Missoula floods in North America or the bursting of the glacial lakes in Siberia. It is a wall of water 2,000 feet high, moving at 60 miles an hour, stripping the soil down to the basalt, carving canyons in a matter of days that would normally take rivers millions of years to erode. The noise would have been deafening, a sonic physical weight that pressed against the chest, the sound of a continent being washed clean. This is the violent thaw, a period where the landscape is reshaped not by the slow grind of the ice, but by the catastrophic rush of the water. The sea level does not creep up, it jumps. During these meltwater pulses, the ocean rises by meters in a single century. The great land bridges, the homes of the ancestors, are drowned. We watch from a high vantage point as the water creeps over the plains of Doggerland, turning the hills into islands and the islands into memories. The hunters must retreat, generation by generation, pushing back to the high ground of modern Europe and Britain, telling stories of the great flood that swallowed their grandfathers' hunting grounds, stories that will persist in myth for 10,000 years. And as the physical ice collapses, the chemical lock is picked as well. The deep ocean, stirred by the violence of the changing currents, finally exhales. The carbon dioxide that had been trapped in the abyss for 100 millennia bubbles back up to the surface, released into the atmosphere like the fizz from a shaken bottle. The greenhouse is rebuilt in a rush. The air thickens, trapping the heat, reinforcing the melt in a runaway feedback loop. The temperature spikes. The dust is washed from the sky by the returning rains. The world turns from white and yellow to a vivid, shocking green. Forests explode northward, reclaiming the steppe at a pace that seems frantic, the trees racing to occupy the land left bare by the retreating ice. The woolly giants, the mammoths, and the rhinos find their world shrinking. The dry grass they need is replaced by wet bogs and thick birch forests, where their heavy feet sink and their shaggy coats overheat. They are creatures of the marathon, not the sprint, and the termination is a sprint. They are pushed north and further north until there is nowhere left to go but the islands of the Arctic Ocean. The thaw is a liberation for the planet, a return to the interglacial warmth that allows civilization to flourish, but it is a catastrophe for the Ice Age biome. It is a messy, chaotic, ungraceful exit. The ice does not leave willingly. It fights, creating cold snaps and glacial surges even as it dies, clawing at the land one last time before dissolving into the rising sea. There is a sense of exhaustion in the aftermath. The earth has shaken off the heavy blanket, but the bed is disheveled, the sheets are torn, and the room is unrecognizable. The 100,000-year mystery has reached its dramatic conclusion. The slow buildup of potential energy, the grinding friction, the starving atmosphere, all culminating in this sudden release. It is like a fever breaking. The patient sweats, shakes, and cries out. And then, in the silence that follows, the breathing steadies. The temperature drops to normal, or in this case, rises to the comfortable warmth of the Holocene. The cycle is complete. The ice has done its work, scrubbing the continents, mixing the genetic codes of the animals, and pressing the crust down, and now it retreats to the poles, leaving behind a world that is scarred, wet, and ready for the new tenants. The violence of the thaw fades into the gentle sound of rivers flowing in their new beds, and the sun shines down on a planet that has been washed new, a planet where the days are long, the seasons are distinct, and the memory of the Great White Wall begins to fade into a dream. The water recedes, the roar of the collapse fades into the gentle lapping of waves on new shorelines, and the world is left quiet, green, and radically transformed, echoing with the memory of the weight it has just shed. We are standing now in the aftermath, in the long, resonant silence that follows the great noise of the termination, looking out at a landscape that has been sculpted by the 100,000-year hand. The mid-Pleistocene transition is no longer an event that is happening. It is an event that has happened, a revolution that has codified the laws of the planet. The new rhythm has settled deep into the bones of the earth, and everything we see around us, every hill, every lake, every jagged coastline, is a testament to its power. The transition did not just freeze the world, it carved it. If you look at a map of the Northern Hemisphere today, you are looking at the fingerprints of the giants we have watched grow and die. The fjordlands of Norway, with their steep, dramatic cliffs plunging into deep, dark water, are not the work of rivers, but the gouge marks of ice tongues that drag themselves into the sea, scratching the granite with the force of 1,000,000 chisels. The Great Lakes of North America, those vast inland seas that hold 20% of the world's fresh surface water, are nothing more than the puddles left behind when the Laurentide ice sheet retreated, filling the depressions it had crushed into the crust. Even the rolling hills of Long Island or Cape Cod are not natural geological formations in the traditional sense. They are piles of debris, terminal moraines bulldozed into place by the leading edge of the glacier and left there when the ice melted, a line of rubble marking the high tide mark of the solid ocean. We are living in the ruins of the Ice Age, walking through the construction site it left behind. The echo of the transition is physical, tangible, and ongoing. The land itself has not yet forgotten the pressure. Beneath our feet, in Canada and Scandinavia, the crust is still rising, springing back up in slow motion from the release of the burden 10,000 years ago. It is a geological exhale that is happening right now, imperceptible to our daily lives but measurable by our instruments. The ground is lifting by a few millimeters a year, tilting the lakes, changing the shorelines, a silent reminder that the Earth is still recovering from the embrace of the 100,000-year winter. This isostatic rebound is the planet's muscle memory, a physical sensation of relief that has lasted longer than recorded human history. But the echo is not just in the rocks, it is in the rhythm of time itself. The transition established a new tempo for the biosphere, a harsh, asymmetrical beat that dictates the terms of existence. We now understand that the normal state of the Earth during the last million years is not the warmth we enjoy today, but the cold. The Ice Age is the baseline, the interglacial is the anomaly. We are living in a brief, frantic gap between the glaciers, a short intake of breath before the long dive returns. The 100,000-year cycle created a world where warmth is a precious fleeting commodity, a holiday from the freezing reality. This realization shifts our perspective on our own place in history. The entirety of human civilization, the first cities of Mesopotamia, the pyramids of Egypt, the steam engines of the Industrial Revolution, the digital cloud, all of it has occurred within the narrow, warm window of the current interglacial, the Holocene. We are the children of the thaw. We flourished because the ice retreated, opening up the river valleys and the coastlines, allowing us to plant our crops in the fine, mineral-rich dust left behind by the glaciers. The Garden of Eden is not a mythic place, but a mythic time, the rare moment in the celestial clockwork when the summer wins against the winter. The transition to the 100,000-year cycle made these moments rare, and thus it made them valuable. It condensed the energy of life into short, intense bursts. It seems that the Earth operates like a bow being drawn back slowly, with great tension, for 90,000 years, only to release the arrow of warmth for 10 or 15,000 years before beginning the draw again. The ecosystem we see today is a climax community, a rush of life filling the vacuum, but it is built on a foundation of instability. The forests of the Amazon, the coral reefs of the Pacific, the oak woodlands of Europe, they are all temporary tenants, occupying space that was recently held by the ice and will, in the natural order of things, be claimed by it again. The deep ocean, too, carries the echo. The water at the bottom of the Pacific is still circulating, still carrying the chemical signature of the last ice age, a slow-moving memory of the cold that takes millennia to flush out. The system has a lag, a hysteresis that means the past is never truly gone. It is always lingering in the deep currents, waiting to cycle back to the surface. And what of the mystery itself? The paradox of the weak signal. It seems that the Earth solved the riddle by becoming a resonator. It learned to listen to the faint hum of eccentricity and ignore the loud shout of the tilt. This shift was not a temporary glitch, but a maturation of the climate system, a move towards a state of high sensitivity and high inertia. The ice sheets became the masters of their own destiny, growing large enough to weather the storms, creating a climate that reinforced their own existence. This hysteresis loop is the legacy of the transition. It means that the Earth is sticky. It likes to stay cold once it gets cold, and it likes to stay warm once it gets warm, until a massive shove forces it to switch tracks. We are currently riding the warm track, the rails greased by the greenhouse gases and the high sea levels, but the memory of the cold track is etched into the landscape. You can see it in the erratics, the massive lonely boulders sitting in the middle of farm fields in Ohio or Brandenburg, rocks that belong to mountains hundreds of miles away. They were carried there by the ice and dropped gently when it melted, solitary monuments to the transport network of the giant. They look out of place, alien like meteorites, but they are natives of the previous cycle, silent watchers that have seen the world white and have seen it green. They remind us that the landscape is fluid, that the solid ground is merely a canvas that gets wiped clean and repainted every 100 millennia. The transition also left an echo in our DNA. The squeezing of the population, the bottlenecks, the desperate migrations across the land bridges, these forged the modern human genome. We are the descendants of those who could read the 100,000-year pulse, who could endure the bottleneck. The Great Winter did not kill us. It refined us. It burned away the excess and left a creature that was adaptable, social, and clever enough to survive the changing of the guard. As we sit here in the twilight of the Holocene, listening to the wind in the trees, we are hearing the same wind that once howled off the ice sheet, only now it is softer, warmer, carrying the scent of flowers instead of rock flour. But the mechanism is still there. The orbit is still stretching and compressing. The tilt is still rocking. The bedrock is still waiting for the friction to return. The machinery of the ice ages has not been dismantled. It has merely been paused. The echo of the transition rings in every valley and every gene, a low-frequency hum that underpins our entire existence. It tells us that stability is an illusion, that the Earth is a restless sleeper, and that the long, deep dream of the ice is the true state of the world, a dream from which we have momentarily and miraculously awoken. The scars on the land are healing, covered in moss and soil, but they are deep, and they run true, pointing the way north, back to the source of the cold, back to the place where the giants sleep, waiting for the rhythm to slow down once again. We open our eyes now, waking from the deep geological trance of the Pleistocene to find ourselves in the gentle golden light of the present moment, a time that scientists call the Holocene, but which feels to us simply like home. The air is soft and humid, carrying the scent of rain on asphalt and the pollen of flowers that would have perished instantly in the chill of the mammoth steppe. We are living in the long summer, a period of unusual climatic stability that has lasted for nearly 12,000 years. It is a time of grace. The great ice sheets have retreated to their mountain keeps in Greenland and Antarctica, harmless white caps on the poles of the world, leaving the continents open and green. To us, looking out at our cities of glass and our fields of wheat, this warmth feels permanent, a birthright of our species. But the history of the 100,000-year cycle teaches us a different, humbler lesson. This warmth is an accident. It is a fragile pause. We are picnicking on the tracks of a train that runs on a very long, very slow schedule. Under the strict rules of the orbital mechanics we have explored, the tilt, the wobble, the eccentricity, the Earth should be cooling down by now. The tilt of the axis is decreasing, the summer sun in the north is growing slightly weaker, and by all rights, the glaciers should be gathering their strength in the high valleys of Canada, preparing for the next descent. The interglacial clock is ticking towards midnight. But something unprecedented has happened. The rhythm has been interrupted. A new geological force has entered the chat, a force that does not come from the stars or the volcanoes or the continental drift, but from us. We, the clever shivering apes who learned to carry fire in the caves of the transition, have learned to dig up the fire stored in the earth itself. We have found the carbon that the ancient oceans buried, the sunlight trapped in the coal and the oil, and we have released it back into the atmosphere in a geological blink of an eye. We have picked the chemical lock. The carbon dioxide levels, which dance so neatly between the low of the ice ages and the high of the interglacials, have now shot past the ceiling, rising to levels not seen for 3 million years, long before the first ice sheet ever formed. We have inadvertently seized the controls of the machine. The 100,000-year cycle, which governed the planet with such ironclad authority, has been suspended. Scientists looking at the models suggest that we have likely delayed the next ice age by 50,000, perhaps even 100,000 years. We have broken the watch. There is a profound irony in this. The very intelligence that was forged by the hardships of the cold has now created a heat that threatens to banish the cold forever. We are no longer just passengers on the ship. We have stumbled into the engine room and pulled the levers, not fully understanding what they do. It seems we've created a super interglacial, a fever spike that pushes the system into uncharted waters. The mystery of the past, why the ice ages became so powerful, has been replaced by the mystery of the future. What happens when a planet built for ice is suddenly forced to be hot? The friction on the bedrock is gone. The ocean currents are being confused not by icebergs, but by the melting of the last reserves. The amplifiers that the Earth developed, the albedo of the snow, the carbon trap of the deep sea, are being triggered in reverse. It feels like a moment of suspension, a breathless pause where the old gods of orbit and tilt are looking down at the new god of industry, waiting to see who will blink first. And yet, despite our power, we remain small. The Earth is vast, and its systems are slow. The heat we have injected into the air will take millennia to fully process. The oceans will continue to rise, the weather will continue to shift, and the biosphere will struggle to adapt to this new, frantic tempo. But the planet itself will endure. It has seen fire before. It has seen ice before. It has a patience that outlasts our anxiety. The lesson of the 100,000-year mystery is that the Earth is not a static background, but a responsive, dynamic partner. It listens. It reacts. It remembers. We have shouted into the canyon, and now we must wait for the echo. The great winter may be postponed, but the machinery is still there, buried under the soil and the sea, waiting for the carbon to settle, waiting for the balance to return. As we walk through our modern lives, complaining about the rain or enjoying the beach, we are walking through a miracle of timing. We are the lucky ones, the generation born in the sweet spot, the inheritors of the thaw. The wind that blows through our streets is the same wind that carved the glaciers, but for now, it is gentle. The sun that warms our faces is the same sun that was once reflected by the ice, but for now, it nourishes the harvest. We can feel the ghost of the ice age in the shape of our hills and the salt of our blood, a reminder of where we came from, and perhaps a warning of where we could go if we forget the delicate balance that keeps the winter at bay. The story of the 100,000 years is not just a story of the past, it is the context for our present. It is the long, dark canvas against which the bright light of human history is painted. We are the stewards of the interglacial, the keepers of the flame, holding back the dark with our ingenuity and our choices. The cycle turns, the stars wheel overhead, and the earth breathes in and out, slow and deep, carrying us all on its back through the vast, cold silence of space. The mystery is solved, but the journey continues. The ice sleeps, the ocean waits, and we, the children of the transition, stand watch in the warmth, grateful for the summer, grateful for the sun, and finally, ready to rest. The fire has burned down to the last glowing embers now, small islands of red in a sea of gray ash. The story is told. The great wheel of the 100,000 years slows, turning slower and slower until it matches the beating of your own heart. The mountains of ice have melted into the rivers of your dreams, and the howling winds of the steppe have softened into the gentle rhythm of your breathing. The vast, heavy time of the planet contracts, folding in on itself, becoming small enough to hold in your hand, light enough to carry into sleep. We are safe here, in the warm, quiet present, anchored by the gravity of the earth and the comfort of the blankets. The giants are gone. The cold is a memory. There's only the stillness of the room and the feeling of drifting, floating on the surface of a deep, calm ocean that has no storms, no waves, only the gentle rocking motion of the stars. Let the history dissolve. Let the dates and the numbers fade away like mist in the morning sun. You are part of the rhythm now, part of the slow, eternal breath of the world. The night is yours. The peace is yours. Sleep now and let the ages drift by. Sweet dreams.